The ballroom was thick with the heavy scent of expensive cigars and aged scotch, a smell that always reminded me of my father's massive ego. It was his 60th birthday gala, and every important person from the Vance construction elite was there to celebrate. I spent the entire evening making sure every detail was perfect. I stood by the catering tray, checking the logistics and ensuring the staff stayed on schedule. I had worked for months on the blueprints for our next big project, and we had discussed my future many times. When my father finally stood up and tapped his glass with a silver spoon, the room went completely silent. I took a deep breath, expecting the announcement we had planned, my official promotion to Chief Operating Officer. Instead, my father put his heavy arm around my brother Leo, who was already 3 drinks in. To my son, my father boomed to the crowd. The future of this company. A man's job requires a man's grit. He didn't even look in my direction as the room erupted in cheers. I felt the air leave my lungs, but I kept my face perfectly still. The humiliation was public, deliberate, and designed to put me in my place. My name is Isabella Vance, and I am 26 years old. To the men in that crowded ballroom, I was just the office girl. I was the one who organized the blueprints, made sure the permits were filed on time, and kept the books looking pretty. They saw my blonde hair and my quiet nature and just assumed I was a placeholder. They thought I was only there until I found a wealthy man to marry. What none of them knew was that while I was filing their boring permits and fetching their coffee, I was leading a secret life. I had secretly finished my master's in structural engineering and venture capital. I wasn't just organized. I was highly overqualified for every job my father gave me. I had spent years learning the intricate details of the industry, watching how these men made expensive mistakes. I knew the numbers better than my father ever would. While they saw a girl who kept things neat, I was actually the only person keeping their world from falling apart. I understood the flow of money, the stress points of steel, and the hidden weaknesses in their business model. They were playing checkers while I was building the board. As the room continued to cheer and applaud for Leo, my father finally turned his head and caught my eye. He didn't look guilty or sorry for breaking his promise. Instead, he gave me a patronizing wink. It was a look that told me not to be emotional or make a scene in front of his important guests. I didn't frown, and I didn't let a single tear show. I didn't leave in a huff like they expected a girl to do. Instead, I walked over calmly, clinked my glass against his, and whispered, "Happy birthday, Dad." Then I slipped out the side door into the cold, quiet night air. As soon as I was alone, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a message from Silas Thorne, the powerful CEO of the Obsidian Group. The message said, "The bridge loan is ready for signature. Are we moving forward?" I didn't hesitate for even a second. I typed one word, "Yes." In that moment, the power dynamic of our family changed forever. Though my father had no idea yet, I was no longer just his daughter. I was effectively his landlord. For the next 6 months, I became a phantom within Vance Construction. I stayed at my desk, performing all my usual duties with terrifying efficiency. I never complained about Leo's new title, even as I watched him miss important deadlines and blow the budget on our new Starlight Tower project. Leo spent more time at long lunches than he did looking at the construction sites. My father ignored every single red flag, blinded by his desire to build a dynasty led by his son. He wanted a legacy that looked like the old world he came from, where women stayed in the background. Meanwhile, every evening from 7 p.m. to midnight, I logged into an encrypted portal from my small apartment. I worked as Consultant V, the primary architect for the Obsidian Group's acquisition strategy. While my father was busy teaching Leo how to be a boss, I was busy learning how to own the ground they were standing on. I knew every financial move Obsidian made because I was the one designing them. I watched our company's debt pile up from 2 different perspectives. The daughter who was ignored and the consultant who was holding the bill. The Starlight Tower project eventually hit a major snag, just as my data predicted it would. A massive structural flaw was discovered in the foundation. It was a mistake that should have been caught months ago, but Leo had been too busy to check the soil reports or the concrete density tests. This error meant a $40 million cost overrun that the company simply didn't have. My father was absolutely furious. He stormed into the main office, screaming at the contractors and blaming everyone but his son. I stayed perfectly calm at my desk. I sat there, sipping tea and watching the security feed of his meltdown. He didn't ask for my help or my engineering expertise. Instead, he poked his head into my office and told me to order lunch for the real engineers who were coming to fix the mess. I did exactly what he asked. I ordered the lunch and made sure it was delivered on time. While the delivery driver was coming up the elevator, I also sent a formal notice of default from the Obsidian Group directly to my father's personal email. The contrast was perfect. To him, I was a waitress. To his creditors, I was the judge. Desperate to save the project, my father invited his partners, the old-school titans of the construction industry, to a private dinner to discuss a bailout. Once again, I was given a secondary role. I was tasked with serving the wine and making sure the guests were comfortable. As I moved around the table, I listened to them mock the anonymous firm called Obsidian that was suddenly squeezing their finances. My father laughed loudly, trying to look strong in front of his friends. "Some shark in a suit thinks they can outmuscle me," my father laughed, shaking his head. I leaned over at that exact moment and refilled his glass with expensive Cabernet without saying a single word. He didn't even look at me as I served him. He had no idea that the shark he was so afraid of was the very person pouring his wine. I felt a strange sense of peace. The more they underestimated me, the more power I gained. They were living in a past where they thought they were untouchable, and I was already living in their future. Every laugh he shared with his partners was another nail in the coffin of his old-world empire. What my father and Leo didn't know was that I had been planning for this for 5 years. I had spent that time building my own separate portfolio of commercial real estate under a secret LLC. While my father spent his company profits on fancy yachts and luxury cars, I lived in a modest apartment and reinvested every single cent I earned. I wasn't just a consultant for Obsidian, I was strategically becoming a silent stakeholder in the very vendors that Vance Construction relied on for survival. I owned pieces of the trucking companies, the equipment rentals, and the material suppliers. I had surrounded my father's business with a web of my own making. He thought he was the king of the industry, but he was slowly becoming a tenant in a world I was buying up piece by piece. My father always told me that loyalty was the most important thing, but he never realized that loyalty is a two-way street. He had abandoned his loyalty to my hard work, so I had moved my loyalty to my own vision. I was the silent partner he never saw coming, and the trap was almost set. A few weeks later, Leo approached my desk, looking completely panicked. "Izzy, the concrete suppliers are refusing to ship any more material to the Starlight site. You need to fix it right now," he demanded. I looked down at the spreadsheets on my screen. I knew exactly why they weren't shipping. I also knew the CEO of that concrete company personally. We had gone to graduate school together and stayed in touch. "I'll see what I can do," I said in a calm, flat voice. I didn't fix it. I didn't call in any favors. I simply let the delay stand. My father needed to see exactly what Leo's manly grit looked like when things actually got difficult. Without me silently fixing every mistake in the background, the company began to grind to a halt. Leo had no idea how to negotiate or how to manage the logistics he had inherited. He was drowning, and my father was too proud to admit he had put the wrong person in charge. The silence from the construction site was deafening, and every day of delay cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars. I just kept working my 9 to 5, acting like everything was normal. Finally, Silas Thorne called for a face-to-face meeting between the Obsidian Group and Vance Construction. My father was terrified of losing the Starlight Tower, but he still tried to act arrogant. He told me I could come along, but I had to stay in the lobby and look professional. He said they might need someone to take notes if the meeting went well. I didn't argue or try to explain my true value. I put on my best charcoal suit and a pair of glasses that I knew made me look about 10 years older and more serious. As we arrived at the Thorne building, my father was sweating through his expensive shirt. He was used to bullying people, but he knew he couldn't bully a firm as large as Obsidian. He kept telling Leo to stand tall and act like a leader. even though Leo looked like he wanted to run away. I walked behind them, carrying a notebook, playing the role of the dutiful daughter one last time. I felt a cold surge of adrenaline. This was the moment everything would change. I was walking into the lion's den, but I was the one who owned the lions. I sat down in the sleek, modern lobby of the Thorn building. My father and Leo walked past me toward the heavy boardroom doors with their heads held high, trying to look important. "Stay put, Izzy," Leo joked with a smirk as he passed. "The big boys are talking now." I watched the doors close behind them. I waited in that lobby for exactly 5 minutes, watching the clock on the wall. I took a moment to reflect on all the years I had spent being ignored. Then, I stood up. I didn't go back to the car. Instead, I walked over to the private executive elevators and swiped a keycard that Silas had given me weeks ago. I rode the elevator straight to the top floor. The doors opened directly into the executive suite. The staff there didn't ask me for ID. They simply nodded and held the door open for me. I walked down the long hallway toward the boardroom where my father was currently pleading for his professional life. I could hear his muffled voice through the wood, still trying to sound like the man in charge. I took a deep breath and opened the door. When I pushed open the heavy boardroom doors and walked in, my father was in the middle of a sentence. He was trying to explain why he needed more time and more money to finish the tower. He stopped talking immediately when he saw me. His face turned a deep shade of red. "Isabella? Get out of here right now, this isn't for you," he barked, pointing toward the door. He looked embarrassed that his office girl had interrupted a high-level meeting, but before I could move, Silas Thorne stood up from the other end of the table. He didn't look at my father with any respect. He looked at me. "Actually, Vittorio, she's the only reason I'm even listening to you at all," Silas said firmly. "Sit down." My father's jaw dropped. He looked back and forth between Silas and me, completely confused. Leo looked like he was about to be sick. The power in the room shifted so fast, it was almost physical. I didn't look like the girl who ordered lunch anymore. I looked like the person who decided if his company would live or die that afternoon. I didn't take a seat in the back of the room like a note-taker. I walked right to the head of the table and sat down in the primary chair. I opened my laptop and began to lay out the cold reality of the situation. I talked about the Starlight Tower's structural failures, the millions of dollars in wasted capital, and the serious legal liabilities Leo had created. I spoke with a clinical, icy precision that I had practiced for years. I used terms my father didn't fully understand and showed data that proved his company was on the verge of total collapse. For the first time in my life, my father didn't see his little girl who kept things pretty. He saw a predator. He saw someone who had been watching him fail and had documented every single mistake. The room was silent except for the sound of my voice. I wasn't angry or loud. I was just factual. And the facts were devastating for the Vance legacy he loved so much. I could see the realization hitting him. The daughter he dismissed was the only one who actually understood his business. After I finished my presentation, I offered my father a deal. It was a lifeline, but it came with a heavy price. I explained that Obsidian would absorb all the company's debt, which would save him from a humiliating bankruptcy. However, there were strict conditions. He would have to step down as chairman immediately. My brother, Leo, would be relegated to a new role called social liaison, a title that sounded fancy but carried absolutely no power or decision-making authority. My father looked at me with a look of pure betrayal. His hands were shaking on the table. "You did this to your own blood?" he whispered, his voice trembling. I looked him right in the eye and didn't blink. "No, Dad," I replied calmly. "You did this to yourself when you stopped looking at the blueprints and started looking at the gender of the person holding them." I gave him 24 hours to decide. Then, I stood up and walked out of the room, leaving him and Leo in the silence of their own making. I had given them a way out, but their pride was still in the way. Driven by his massive pride, my father walked out of the meeting without signing anything. He convinced himself that he could find the money somewhere else. He spent the next few days calling his oldest friends, the uncles, and the titans of industry who had been at his birthday gala. He went to them one by one, begging for a loan or a partnership to push Obsidian out. But every single one of them turned him down. What he didn't realize was that they had already been briefed by their own financial advisors. And those advisors had been briefed by me weeks ago. I had shown them the true state of Vance Construction's books. No one wanted to jump onto a sinking ship, especially not for a man who was clearly out of his depth. My father was finding out that loyalty, in his world, was only as strong as the last profit margin. He was suddenly very much alone in the industry he thought he ruled. He called people he had known for 40 years, and they wouldn't even take his calls. The walls were finally closing in on him. The next month was what I like to call a masterclass in atmospheric pressure. I watched from the sidelines as the construction site for the Starlight Tower went completely silent. The massive cranes stopped moving, and the workers stayed home because the checks were bouncing. The Vance name, which had once been a symbol of power and quality in New York, quickly became a joke among the trades. People talked about how the old man had lost his touch and let his son ruin everything. I stayed at the office every day, working my 9-to-5 job and being perfectly polite to everyone. I never brought up the boardroom meeting or the deal I had offered. I just did my work and waited. It was a slow burn, watching the empire crumble. My father spent most of his days behind his closed office door, and Leo stopped coming in altogether. The empire was falling apart, and the silence was more powerful than any argument. I could see the stress in my father's eyes every time he left his office, but he still wouldn't admit he needed me. One afternoon, Leo came into my office. He wasn't joking or smirking this time. He was actually crying. He threw a stack of legal papers onto my desk. He was being sued personally by a major subcontractor for a contract he had signed while he was out drinking with his friends. The numbers were huge, and he had no way to pay. "Help me, Izzy. Please talk to Dad. Tell him what to do," he pleaded, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. I looked at him with genuine pity. He wasn't a villain. He was just a spoiled boy who had been given a job he wasn't qualified for. "Leo, I told you months ago that the language in that contract was flawed and dangerous," I said softly. "You told me to stop worrying and go buy more toner for the office printer." I didn't help him. I couldn't. He had to feel the weight of the responsibility he had bragged about having. He left my office in tears, realizing for the first time that his name wouldn't protect him from his own mistakes. Finally, the day arrived that my father had dreaded. Vance Construction was forced into a public restructuring hearing in a downtown courtroom. It was a high-stakes event, and all the uncles and industry rivals were there to watch the empire officially fall. My father sat at the defense table, looking much older and gray than he had just a few months ago. He looked defeated, but there was still a small spark of hope in his eyes. He still believed that a secret investor was going to come in at the last minute and save him. He had heard rumors of a white knight who was buying up the company's bad debt to prevent a total liquidation. He kept glancing at the courtroom door, waiting for someone to walk in and hand him a check. He didn't realize that the person who had been buying that debt wasn't there to save his ego. They were there to finalize the transition of power. He sat there clutching a lucky pen, unaware that his destiny had already been written by someone else. The room was packed with people who once feared him, now just curious to see him fail. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and the investor finally arrived. It was Victoria Sterling, the most powerful woman in New York real estate and my father's oldest, fiercest rival. My father actually beamed when he saw her. He stood up slightly, thinking his old friend had decided to help him out of professional respect. He thought their long history meant something. Victoria walked down the aisle with total confidence and took the stand. But she didn't look at my father with any warmth. "I am not here today for Vittorio Vance," she told the judge firmly. "I am here today as a legal proxy for the majority shareholder of the newly formed Vance-Sterling merger." The room went quiet as everyone tried to figure out who could possibly have more shares than the man who started the company. My father's smile slowly faded as he realized something was very wrong with his plan. He looked at his lawyer, who was frantically checking papers. The White Knight wasn't there to rescue him. She was there to deliver a message from the person who now controlled his life's work. My father's lawyer stood up, looking just as confused as his client. "Who is the majority shareholder?" he asked loudly. Victoria didn't answer with words at first. Instead, she turned and looked directly at me. I was sitting quietly in the very back row of the gallery, wearing a simple dress and holding my purse. "Isabella Vance is the majority shareholder," Victoria announced to the court. "She has been quietly buying out the minority partner's shares for the last 3 years, using her own private equity earnings and independent investments." The room went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the carpeted floor. My father turned around in his seat, his eyes wide with shock. He looked at me, as if he were seeing a stranger for the first time. The office girl was now the owner of the building, the company, and the very chair he was sitting in. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. The realization that I had been outmaneuvering him for years while sitting right under his nose was a blow more powerful than any financial loss. My father tried to lash out one last time. He stood up and shouted that I had used insider information and that I was betraying my own family. I didn't shout back. I stood up, calm and steady, and walked toward the front of the courtroom. "Actually, Dad, I didn't betray you. I saved you," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the room. "If I hadn't spent my own money to buy those shares and secure that debt, the bank would have foreclosed on everything today. They would have taken your house, your cars, and your pension. I am the only reason you aren't standing in a shelter right now." I laid out the documents that proved the bank was ready to seize his personal assets. I had stepped in and bought the debt just hours before the deadline. I had protected the family, but I had done it by taking control away from the people who were driving it into the ground. I wasn't the enemy. I was the only person who had actually been loyal to the Vance legacy. My father sat down slowly, the anger leaving him and being replaced by a profound, crushing embarrassment. In the middle of my explanation, a loud ringing sound echoed through the courtroom. It was Leo's phone. He tried to silence it, but he looked terrified. A few moments later, a man in a suit walked into the room and identified himself as an agent for the FBI. It turned out that in his desperation to look successful, Leo had tried to cook the books to hide the Starlight Tower's massive losses. He had committed serious financial fraud without telling me or our father. He thought he was being tough and brave, just like the men in the stories our father told. My father slumped back into his chair, finally realizing that his son's grit was actually a felony. Everything he had built was now tainted by a crime he hadn't even known about. The legacy he wanted so badly was falling apart in the most shameful way possible, right in front of all his peers. He looked at Leo, not with pride, but with a mixture of horror and pity. The manly successor he had chosen had nearly destroyed everything they had through sheer incompetence and ego. I didn't let the FBI take Leo away that day. I stepped to the front of the court and spoke to the judge. I didn't ask for my brother to be arrested or punished. Instead, I presented a signed document showing that I had already discovered the discrepancies weeks ago and had used my own personal funds to clear them and correct the records. I had essentially fixed the crime before it could even be prosecuted. I had protected both my father and my brother, even after they had publicly discarded and humiliated me. The judge looked at the documents, then looked at me with profound respect. He saw the level of brilliance and foresight it took to manage a crisis of that scale. He dismissed the immediate charges against the company, pending the restructuring I had proposed. I had saved the family name, but the name no longer belonged to my father. I had proven that I was the only one who truly understood what it meant to lead and to protect. The room was filled with murmurs of shock at my level of preparation. My father stood up as if he wanted to say something, but for the first time in his entire life, he had absolutely nothing to say. He looked around the room at the men he had called his partners and his uncles. He realized that none of them were looking at him for leadership anymore. They were all looking at me, waiting for my instructions on what to do next. The power had completely drained out of him. He was no longer the Don of the construction world. He was just an old man who had missed out on the most valuable, loyal, and capable person in his life because he was too busy looking for a reflection of himself in his son. He looked small, tired, and defeated. He had spent 60 years building an empire, and in one afternoon he realized he had built it on a foundation of his own pride, while I had built mine on actual concrete and intelligence. He walked out of the courtroom with his head down, a broken man who finally understood the cost of his own ignorance. I didn't keep the company name the same. I rebranded it as Vance and Thorne Associates. I kept all the hard-working staff who had been worried about their jobs, and I gave the underpaid secretaries and junior engineers significant raises. I personally oversaw the completion of the Starlight Tower, and we finished it 2 months ahead of schedule and under the new budget. The building became a marvel of modern engineering, and my face became the new face of the New York skyline. I was no longer the ghost in the machine. I was the machine itself. I proved that you don't need to be loud or aggressive to lead. You just need to be the most prepared person in the room. The industry changed, and the old-school uncles had to learn how to work with a woman who knew their business better than they did. I didn't seek revenge through cruelty. I sought it through success. Every skyscraper I finished was a testament to the daughter they thought was only good for taking notes. A year later, I drove out to visit my father at his quiet retirement villa. The one that I pay for every month. We sat together on the porch, looking out at the garden. He tried to give me some advice on a new bridge project I was starting in the city. I just smiled, gently patted his hand, and stood up to leave. "I've got it handled, Dad," I said in a kind but firm voice. He started to say something else, and then he stopped. He looked like he was about to apologize, his voice cracking with emotion. I held up a hand to stop him before he could start. "You don't need to say it," I told him. "The buildings speak for themselves." I walked to my car, feeling the silence between us finally become peaceful. I drove back toward the city, toward the skyline that I had built with my own hands, my own mind, and my own silence. I was no longer defined by his denial, I was defined by my own achievements.